The rope burned against Cordelia's wrists as she stumbled forward on the makeshift platform, dirt coating her once pristine blue dress. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty town square of Bitter Creek. Arizona Territory, 1882. What am I bid for this here fine specimen? Strong hands, good for cooking and cleaning. Cordelia's green eyes blazed with defiance as she scanned the crowd of leering faces. 3 days ago, she'd been traveling west with her uncle's wagon train when Apache raiders struck. Now she stood, like cattle, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder by these vultures who called themselves traders. $50. Called out a pot-bellied merchant. $75. Countered a grizzled rancher. Then the crowd fell silent. A massive shadow fell across the platform as someone approached from the back. Cordelia's breath caught as she saw him, easily 7 feet tall, with bronze skin and coal-black hair that fell past his shoulders. Intricate tattoos covered his muscled arms, and a single eagle feather hung from a leather cord around his neck. But it wasn't his imposing size that made her heart race. It was the intelligence burning in his dark eyes as they met hers. 200, his voice rumbled like distant thunder, spoken in perfect English that surprised everyone present. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. $200? Well, I'll be gold, the giant Apache added, producing a leather pouch. That clinked heavily. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one dared bid against him. Cordelia watched, mesmerized, as he counted out gleaming coins with hands that could crush a man's skull but moved with surprising gentleness. Sold to the ... The auctioneer stammered, clearly uncomfortable. Nahual, the Apache supplied. His gaze never leaving Cordelia's face. As the auctioneer fumbled with the transaction, Cordelia found her voice. I won't be anyone's property, she declared, her chin lifting defiantly despite her circumstances. A ghost of a smile played at Nahual's lips. No, he agreed quietly, you won't. Before she could process his words, he vaulted onto the platform with fluid grace that belied his size. The crowd gasped and several men reached for their guns, but Nahual paid them no mind. He pulled out a wicked-looking knife, and Cordelia tensed, only to feel the rope around her wrists fall away. You're coming with me, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. It wasn't a command. Somehow, impossibly, it sounded like a request. Why? She whispered, rubbing her freed wrists. Because, he said, offering her his massive hand, you have fire in your eyes that shouldn't be caged. The crowd was growing. Restless, voices rising with ugly intent. Nahual seemed to sense it too. We leave now, he murmured urgently. Cordelia hesitated for just a moment, weighing her options. Stay and face whatever fate these men had planned, or trust this mysterious Apache who just paid a fortune for her freedom. If that's truly what this was, she took his hand. The thundering of hooves echoed behind them as Nahual's powerful stallion carried them away from Bitter Creek. Cordelia clung to his broad back, her arms wrapped around his waist as they raced across the desert landscape. The horse, a magnificent black beast with white markings, seemed to fly over the rocky terrain. They're following us, she shouted over the wind, glancing back to see a cloud of dust and the glint of rifles. Let them try, Nahual replied, grimly, guiding his mount toward a narrow canyon ahead. Tempest knows these lands better than they know their own shadows. As if responding to his words, the stallion surged forward with renewed speed. They plunged into the canyon's cool shadows just as the first gunshots cracked behind them. Bullets sparked off stone walls as Nahual navigated the twisting passage with uncanny skill. Hold tight, he warned, and suddenly they were climbing almost vertically up a hidden trail that seemed impossible for any horse to manage. Tempest's hooves found purchase on ledges barely wide enough for a man's boot. When they finally stopped on a high mesa overlooking the desert, their pursuers were nowhere to be seen. Cordelia slid from the horse on shaking legs, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who are you?" she demanded, her fear giving way to curiosity. "You're not like other Apache I've encountered." Nawal dismounted with fluid grace, then began unsaddling Tempest. "What do you know of my people?" he asked without looking at her. "Only what I've heard, that you're savage, raiders, killers." She immediately felt foolish for the words. This time he did look at her, and she saw something that might have been amusement in his dark eyes. "I attended Harvard University for 3 years, he said matter-of-factly, pulling supplies from his saddlebags. "Before I decided the white man's education couldn't teach me who I was meant to be." Cordelia's mouth fell open. "Harvard? But how?" "My father was chief of our band. When I was 16, he made a deal with missionaries. They would educate me in exchange for safe passage through our territory." Nawal began building a fire with practiced efficiency. "I learned your language, your customs, your literature. Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau." "Then why did you leave?" His hand stilled on the kindling. "Because I realized they were trying to kill the Apache in me, not educate him. They wanted to turn me into something I'm not." He struck flint to steel, coaxing flame from dry grass. "So I came home to my people, though I kept what knowledge served me." Cordelia settled on a nearby rock, studying this enigmatic man who defied every expectation. "And the money?" $200 in gold isn't exactly common among ... among savages, he supplied wryly. She flushed. "I didn't mean, we raid supply trains heading west. But not for scalps or blood sport, as your newspapers claim. We take what we need to survive: food, weapons, medicine. Sometimes there are strong boxes." He looked at her directly. "I saved that gold for something important. Today, I found what that was." "A cook?" she asked skeptically. Nawal shook his head, beginning to prepare what looked like a simple meal from his supplies. "I told them I needed a cook because it was the only way they'd sell you to me without trouble. If I'd said I was buying you to set you free ... double quote," he shrugged. "Dead Apache tell no tales. So you risked your life for a stranger, perhaps." He handed her a piece of dried meat and some wild berries. "Or perhaps I recognized something in you that called to something in me." As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Cordelia found herself studying Nawal's profile in the firelight. There was wisdom in his face and a gentleness that contradicted his fearsome size. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now," he said, "you choose your own path. I can take you to the nearest town, give you money to travel wherever you wish, or ... double quote," he hesitated. "Or you could come with me to my village, learn our ways. See if the fire in your eyes burns as bright in the desert as it did on that auction block." 3 days later, Cordelia rode behind Nawal as they approached his village, hidden in a valley between towering red cliffs. She'd chosen to stay, though she couldn't fully explain why. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the way he'd given her the choice without pressure or expectation. The village was unlike anything she'd imagined. Clean wickiups dotted the valley floor, smoke rising from cooking fires. Children played in a clear stream while women worked with intricate beadwork and pottery. It looked ... peaceful. But as they rode into the camp, the peaceful atmosphere shattered. Warriors emerged from their dwellings, hands moving to weapons. Women pulled there, children closer. An elderly man with silver braids and stern features strode forward, his weathered face dark with anger. "Janko," Nawal said respectfully, dismounting and helping Cordelia down. "Father." "What is this?" Janko demanded in Apache, his voice sharp. as a blade. Though Cordelia couldn't understand the words, his meaning was clear enough. Nahwal replied in the same language, his tone steady but firm. The conversation grew heated, with several other warriors joining in. Cordelia stood frozen, acutely aware that she was the subject of their dispute. Finally, a woman emerged from the largest dwelling. She was perhaps 50, with prematurely white hair and kind eyes that reminded Cordelia of her own mother. She spoke a few quiet words that silenced the arguing men. "Ayana," Nahwal said, relief evident in his voice. "Mother." The woman, Ayana, approached Cordelia slowly, studying her with intelligent eyes. She spoke in broken but clear English. "You choose to come?" "Yes," Cordelia replied, lifting her chin despite her nervousness. Ayana nodded approvingly. "Good. Choice important." She turned to her husband and spoke rapidly in Apache. Whatever she said seemed to carry weight. Janko's stern expression softened slightly, though he still looked displeased. "My mother says you may stay until the next full moon," Nahwal translated. "If you prove yourself useful and respectful, you may remain longer. If not, I understand," Cordelia said quickly. "Thank you." The next few days were the hardest of Cordelia's life. She'd always considered herself capable, but Apache life demanded skills she'd never needed. Ayana patiently taught her to grind corn, prepare pemmican, and tend the cooking fires. Other women watched with barely concealed skepticism as Cordelia struggled with tasks they'd mastered as children. The men, led by Janko, were even less welcoming. They spoke around her as if she were invisible, their displeasure with Nahwal's decision evident in their cold glances. Only Nahwal himself seemed unaffected by the tension. He went about his duties, hunting, scouting, crafting weapons, with quiet confidence. But Cordelia noticed he made sure she was never alone with the more hostile members of the tribe. "They think I'm weak," she said one evening as they sat by the stream. She'd been practicing with a bow under his instruction, her arms aching from the unfamiliar motions. "Are you?" he asked simply, adjusting her stance with gentle hands. "No," she replied fiercely. "I survived the Apache raid 3 days in traitor hands and I'm still standing." "I'm not weak." "Then prove it," he said, stepping back. "Not to them, to yourself." The next morning brought the test Cordelia didn't know she'd been waiting for. A young boy, Ayana's grandson, Koda, fell from a cliff while gathering eagle feathers. By the time they found him, he was unconscious with a badly broken leg and fevering from infection. The village medicine man worked over the boy for hours while the family waited in anguish. But the infection was spreading, and traditional remedies weren't enough. "I can help," Cordelia said suddenly, kneeling beside the medicine man. "I know about infection. My mother was a midwife. She taught me about herbs and healing." The medicine man looked at her skeptically, but Ayana nodded urgently. "Please," she whispered, working together. Cordelia showed the medicine man techniques her mother had learned from army doctors. They cleaned the wound properly, set the bone with splints, and applied poultices of herbs Cordelia recognized from her mother's teachings. For 3 days and nights, Cordelia barely left the boy's side. She monitored his fever, changed his bandages, and forced healing broths between his lips. Slowly, gradually, the infection began to recede. When Koda finally opened his eyes and asked for water, the entire village seemed to exhale in relief. Ayana embraced Cordelia with tears in her eyes, and even some of the hostile warriors nodded their approval. That night, as Cordelia sat exhausted by the dying fire, Nahwal appeared beside her with a blanket and a cup of herbal tea. "You saved him," he said softly. "We saved him," she corrected. "Your medicine man knew far more than I did. I just did what I could." Nahwal settled beside her. close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. That's what I hoped you would understand. We're stronger together than apart. Cordelia looked at him in the firelight, seeing not just the 15-year-old fierce Apache warrior, but the Harvard-educated man who chose his own path. Is that why you bought me? To make the tribe stronger? No, he said quietly. I bought you because from the moment I saw you, I knew my heart would never be the same. 2 months passed like seasons in a dream. Cordelia found herself settling into Apache life with surprising ease, her initial struggles giving way to genuine skill and respect within the community. She could now track game, weave baskets that didn't fall apart, and speak enough Apache to hold simple conversations, but it was her growing feelings for Nahuel that truly unsettled her. He was unlike any man she'd ever known, gentle with children, respectful to elders, yet fierce as a mountain cat when danger threatened. She'd watched him spend hours carving a toy horse for young Coda, then seen him return from a hunt with enough meat to feed 3 families. His intelligence challenged her, his kindness disarmed her, and his rare smiles made her heart race. Problem was Jenko's growing pressure for his son to take a proper Apache wife. Nayeli is the daughter of a great chief, Cordelia overheard Ayana telling her son one evening. Though she spoke in English for Cordelia's benefit, her meaning was clear. She would bring strong alliances, strong children. Nayeli was everything. Cordelia wasn't, tall, graceful, with the kind of natural beauty that made men stumble over their words. She'd arrived a week ago with a delegation from her father's tribe, and her interest in Nahuel was obvious to everyone. She would make you happy, Ayana continued gently, and she would make our people stronger. Nahuel's response was too quiet for Cordelia to hear, but she saw Ayana's disappointed expression and knew the conversation wasn't over. That night, unable to sleep, Cordelia walked to the stream where she and Nahuel had spent so many evenings. She wasn't surprised to find him there, sitting on their usual rock with Tempest grazing nearby. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, settling beside him. Too many thoughts, he admitted, his voice heavy with tension. They sat in comfortable silence, for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Finally, Cordelia found her courage. Your parents are right, you know. Nayeli would make you a good wife. She's beautiful, accomplished, and she understands your world in ways I never will. Now we'll turn to study her face in the moonlight. Is that what you think I want? Isn't it what you should want? She countered, her voice barely above a whisper. What your people need. Instead of answering, he reached out and traced her cheek with one gentle finger. When I was at Harvard, I learned about many things: philosophy, literature, science. But the most important thing I learned was that the heart doesn't follow logic or duty. It follows truth. And what is your truth? That I love you, he said simply. Not because you're useful to the tribe or because you saved Coda's life, though. Both matter. I love you because you chose to stay when you could have left. Because you face each challenge without complaint. Because when you smile, it's like sunrise after the longest night. Cordelia's breath caught. She'd hoped, dreamed, but hadn't dared believe. I love you too, she whispered. But Nahuel, the complications, will work themselves out, he said firmly, pulling her closer. If we're strong enough to face them together. Their first kiss was soft, tentative, full of wonder and promise. The second was deeper, more urgent. As if they were trying to pour months of unspoken feelings into a single moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. This won't be easy, Cordelia warned. Your father still doesn't fully trust me. And Nayeli's delegation expects an answer soon. Then they'll get one, Nahuel said, his jaw set with determination. Tomorrow I'll speak to the tribal council. I'll tell them I choose you, and if they refuse to accept me, His arms tightened around her. Then we'll make our own path. Together. The next morning brought chaos to the peaceful village. A rider thundered in at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. It was Dakota, one of Nowell's scouts, and his news was grim. "Soldiers," he gasped, accepting water from Ayana. 2 days' ride east. A full company, maybe more. They're asking questions in every settlement about a missing white woman. Cordelia's blood ran cold. Somehow, someone had connected her disappearance to Apache territory. "They have Apache guides," Dakota continued. "Men from the reservation who know our hiding places. They're coming this way." Janko immediately began barking orders, organizing the village's defenses. But Cordelia knew the truth. If the army found her here, it would mean war for Nowell's people. They'd be forced onto a reservation or worse. "I have to go," she said quietly to Nowell as the village erupted in preparation. "If they find me here ... No," his voice was granite. "We face this together, remember?" But even as he spoke, Cordelia was forming a desperate plan. One that would save his people and prove her love, even if it meant losing everything she'd found. That night, while the village prepared for the worst, Cordelia slipped away like a shadow. She left behind a letter written on birch bark with charcoal, her hands trembling as she formed each word. "My beloved Nowell, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The soldiers are coming for me, and I won't let your people pay the price for my presence. This is my choice, my sacrifice. Please don't follow me. It would only make things worse. Remember that I love you and that the months in your village were the happiest of my life." Forever yours, Cordelia. She took only water and a knife, knowing she had perhaps a day's head start before they discovered her absence. Her plan was simple but desperate: intercept the soldiers before they reached the village, surrender herself, and claim she'd escaped on her own and been surviving in the wilderness. The desert at night was a different world, full of sounds and shadows that made her heart race. But Cordelia pressed on, guided by stars and the memory of the path Dakota had described. She had to reach the soldiers first. Dawn found her stumbling across rocky terrain, her dress torn and her lips cracked from thirst. But in the distance, she could see a dust cloud, the approaching cavalry. She forced her aching legs to carry her toward them, rehearsing her story. The soldiers surrounded her with drawn weapons before she could speak, their faces hard with suspicion. "Please," she gasped, falling to her knees in feigned exhaustion. "I'm Cordelia Ashworth. I was taken by Apache raiders weeks ago. I managed to escape, but I've been lost." The commanding officer, a stern-faced captain named Morrison, studied her with skeptical eyes. "Escaped Apache? In those clothes? Miss, you don't look like someone who's been surviving in the desert." Cordelia's heart sank. Her deception was too flimsy. But before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the morning air. Because she wasn't surviving alone. She spun around to see Nowell emerging from behind a large boulder, his hands raised but his bearing proud and unafraid. Behind him came his father Janko and a dozen Apache warriors. "Nowell, no!" Cordelia cried. "I told you not to follow." "And I told you we face everything together," he replied calmly, never taking his eyes off the nervous soldiers. Captain Morrison's hand moved to his pistol. "Stand down, all of you. You're surrounded." "Actually," Janko said in surprisingly clear English, "you are." As if by magic, Apache warriors seemed to materialize from the rocks all around them. They held bows with arrows nocked, but their posture was more defensive than aggressive. "We didn't come to fight," Nowell said, addressing Morrison directly. "We came to talk." "Indians don't talk with the U.S. Army," Morrison snapped. "They surrender. Or they die." "This one went to Harvard," Cordelia said desperately. He speaks 6 languages and can quote Shakespeare. Maybe you should listen." Morrison's eyes widened slightly, but his grip on his weapon didn't loosen. "That's supposed to impress." "Me? No," Nowell said calmly, "but this might." From his shirt, he produced an official-looking document. "I'm formally requesting parley under the terms of the Treaty of Bosque Redondo. As a chief son and educated representative of my people, I have that right." The captain hesitated. Cordelia could see the calculation in his eyes, a massacre. Here would bring unwanted attention, especially if word got out that they'd killed educated Indians attempting legal negotiations. "You have 5 minutes," Morrison said finally. Nahul stepped forward, his bearing regal despite the circumstances. Miss Ashworth was not kidnapped. She was purchased from illegal slave traders in Bitter Creek, freed, and invited to join our community. She came of her own free will and has been an honored guest." "That's preposterous," Morrison scoffed. "A white woman living with savages?" "Captain," Cordelia interrupted, finding her courage, "it's true. I chose to stay. Nowell saved me from men who would have sold me like livestock. His people took me in, protected me, treated me better than my own society ever did." "Even if that's true," Morrison said, "you're still a white woman. You belong with your own kind." "Do I?" Cordelia challenged. "My own kind put me up for auction. My own kind would force me into a loveless marriage for financial gain. These people, his people, they judge others by their actions, not the color of their skin." She moved to stand beside Nahul, taking his massive hand in both of hers. "I'm in love with this man, Captain, and he loves me. We want to be married, to build a life together." Morrison looked genuinely stunned. "You can't be serious. You're talking about marrying an Indian." "I'm talking about marrying the best man I've ever known," Cordelia replied firmly. "A man who risked everything to save a stranger, who treats everyone with respect, who is trying to build a bridge between 2 worlds that desperately need to understand each other." For a long moment, the only sound was wind whistling through the rocks. Then Morrison holstered his weapon with a disgusted shake of his head. "This is the damnedest thing I ever heard," he muttered. "But if you're telling me you're here by choice, and you're of sound mind, then legally ... He trailed off, clearly unhappy with the situation. "Then legally, you have no grounds to take her," Nahul finished quietly. Morrison glared at them both, then at his men, who were looking equally bewildered by this turn of events. Finally, he spat in the dust. "Fine, but don't expect the army to come running when you change your mind, miss. This is your choice to make and live with." As the soldiers mounted up and rode away, Cordelia sagged with relief. But her ordeal wasn't over yet. Now came the hardest part, convincing Nowell's people that love could triumph over tradition. The tribal council convened that evening under a canopy of brilliant stars. Cordelia sat beside Ayanna, her heart hammering as the Apache leaders debated her fate in their native tongue. She understood enough now to catch fragments, words about tradition, about outsiders, about the dangers of mixing worlds. Janko spoke at length, his weathered face grave in the firelight. Though his tone wasn't harsh, Cordelia could sense his deep concerns about his son's chosen path. When it was Nowell's turn to speak, he stood with quiet dignity, his voice carrying the authority of his education and the passion of his convictions. "My father speaks of tradition," he said in English so Cordelia could understand. "But our greatest tradition is survival, adapting when we must, taking strength from wherever we find it. Cordelia has brought healing knowledge that saved young Coda. She has shown courage that impressed even our warriors. She has chosen us when she could have chosen comfort and safety among her own people." Coda, the scout, nodded agreement. "She could have led the soldiers straight to us." Instead, she tried to draw them away, risking her own life for hours. "But what of children?" asked an elderly woman. "What of the blood that runs in their veins?" Ihana surprised everyone by standing. "I have watched this woman for months," she said slowly. "I have seen her learn our ways not from duty but from love. I have seen her heal our sick, comfort our grieving, and face hardship without complaint. Blood does not make family. Choice does. Heart does." She turned to face Cordelia directly. "You saved my grandson's life. You have earned the right to call this place home if you truly wish it." Tears pricked Cordelia's eyes at the unexpected support. But the debate was far from over. Other voices rose, some in support, others in opposition. The discussion grew heated as tradition warred with progress, fear battled love. Finally, Janko raised his hand for silence. As the voices stilled, he looked directly at Cordelia. "You say you choose our people over your own," he said in careful English. "But choosing is easy when life is peaceful. What happens when the soldiers return with more men? When other white settlers see you living as Apache and decide we are a threat to be destroyed? Will you still choose us when that choice brings suffering to innocent children?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Cordelia rose slowly, knowing this was her moment, perhaps her only chance to prove herself worthy of the love she'd found. "Chief Janko," she said formally, "you ask what I will do when choosing your people brings suffering. But I've already made that choice. When I learned soldiers were coming, I tried to leave to protect you all, even though it would have broken my heart. When they surrounded us in the desert, I stood with your son instead of running to the safety of my own kind." She took a breath, steadying herself. "You're right that more conflicts will come. White settlers are moving west in greater numbers, and fear makes people do terrible things. But we believe, that understanding between our peoples is possible. Nawal learned your ways and the white man's ways. I'm learning to bridge both worlds too." She gestured to the assembled council. "Look around this fire tonight. We're not just Apache and white woman anymore. We're family, debating family business. If we can find common ground here, maybe others can too. Maybe our children can grow up in a world where they don't have to choose between their mothers' people and their father's people, but can honor both." Janko studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, to her amazement, he smiled, the first genuine smile he'd ever given her. "You speak like a chief's wife should," he said simply, with wisdom and courage, thinking of the tribe's future, not just her own happiness. He turned to his son. "Nawal, you have chosen well. But marriage brings responsibilities. Are you prepared to lead when I can no longer do so? To make decisions not just for yourself and your wife, but for all our people? With Cordelia beside me, I can face anything," Nawal replied firmly. Janko nodded slowly, then looked around the circle of faces. "Who speaks against this union?" Silence greeted his question. Even those who'd been most opposed seemed moved by the evening's revelations. Then, "It is decided," Janko declared. "At the next new moon, we will celebrate the marriage of my son Nawal to Cordelia. May their union bring strength to our people and hope for the future." As the council dispersed, Cordelia found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Even Naeli, who'd remained silent throughout the debate, approached with grace. "I see now why. He chose you," she said simply. "You have a warrior's heart, even if you wear a woman's dress. Be happy, sister." Later, as Cordelia and Nawal walked hand in hand under the star-filled sky, she marveled at how much her life had changed since that terrible day in Bitter Creek. "Are you truly ready for this?" Nawal asked softly. "Marriage to me means leaving. Behind everything you knew before, there may be no going back." Cordelia stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes bright with love and determination. "Now, she said, "you bought me for $200 in gold, thinking you were saving a stranger. Instead, you found your heart's other half. I was lost before I met you, not just on that auction block, but in life itself. You gave me purpose, family, love beyond anything I ever dreamed possible." She stood on tiptoe to kiss him gently. "The only thing I can't face is a life without you." 3 years later, Cordelia stood at the edge of their village, watching the sun paint the desert cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. Her hands rested protectively over her rounded belly, where their first child grew strong and healthy. Beside her, little Coda, now walking with only the slightest limp from his old injury, played with the wooden horse Nahol had carved for him. The village had grown in those 3 years. Word had spread among both Apache bands and white settlers about the unusual community where two worlds coexisted in harmony. They'd welcomed a handful of other mixed couples, former soldiers who'd married Apache women, and even a few white families seeking a different way of life on the frontier. "Aunt Cordelia," Coda said, using the Apache term of respect she'd earned, "tell me the story again about how Uncle Nawal bought you with gold." Cordelia laughed, settling carefully on a nearby rock. "Which part do you want to hear? How scared I was on that auction block, or how brave your uncle was to face down all those angry men?" "The part where you decided to stay," the boy said solemnly. "Grandmother Ayana says it was the bravest thing she ever saw." "Your grandmother is very wise," Cordelia agreed, watching as Nahwal approached from the village, his arms full of firewood. Even after 3 years of marriage, the sight of him still made her heart skip. He was no longer just a war chief now. He'd become something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds. Government officials consulted him on territorial disputes. White settlers sought his advice on surviving desert life. Other Apache leaders came to learn how his village had achieved such prosperity without sacrificing their cultural identity. The council meeting went well?" Cordelia asked as he settled beside her, one large hand coming to rest gently on her belly. "Very well," he confirmed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The territorial governor wants to establish a permanent trading post here. Says our village is proof that whites and Apaches can work together for mutual benefit." "And what did you tell him?" "That we'd consider it if he guarantees the rights of all our people, Apache and white alike. No one gets forced onto reservations. No one gets their land taken without fair compensation." Coda looked up from his toy with bright, curious eyes. "Will there really be a trading post, with candy like the one in Tucson?" "Maybe," Nawal said with a smile, ruffling the boy's hair. "But you'll have to ask your aunt here. She's the one who'll probably end up managing it." Cordelia had indeed become something of a businesswoman over the years, using her knowledge of both cultures to facilitate trade between Apache craftsmen and white merchants. Her beadwork and pottery had found their way to markets as far east as Denver, while she'd helped Apache hunters find buyers for their furs and hides in white settlements. "Speaking of business," she said, pulling a letter from her dress pocket, "this came with the last supply wagon." Nawal's expression grew serious. As he read, the letter was from a U.S. Marshal named Patterson asking for their help with a delicate situation. Renegade traders, not unlike the ones who'd originally sold Cordelia, were operating along the border, kidnapping both white and Apache women to sell in Mexico. The marshal wanted to hire Nawal as a guide and interpreter for a joint rescue. "Mission. Dangerous work," Cordelia observed. "Necessary work," Nawal replied grimly. "These traders prey on the innocent. How many women like you might be suffering right now?" She placed her hand over his. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow dawn." "But Cordelia, with the baby coming." "The baby isn't due for 3 months," she interrupted firmly. "And this village needs your leadership in the wider world." Besides, she added with a mischievous smile, I have excellent midwives here, and your mother would never forgive you if you missed the birth. That evening, as the village settled into its nightly rhythms, Cordelia and Nowell sat together in their wickiup, talking quietly about their future. The walls were decorated with a mixture of Apache artwork and small mementos from Cordelia's former life, a Bible from her mother, a photograph of her late father, letters from friends back east who'd been amazed to learn she was not only alive but thriving. Do you ever regret it? Nahwal asked suddenly. Choosing this life over the one you could have had? Cordelia considered the question seriously. She could have been the wife of some merchant or rancher by now, living in a proper house with servants and society gatherings. She could have worn silk dresses and attended church socials, worried about nothing more challenging than the latest fashions from New York. Instead, she lived in a wickiup made of brush and hides, wore deerskin dresses decorated with beads she'd sewn herself, and spent her days grinding corn, tending gardens, and helping settle disputes between people from two very different worlds. Her hands were calloused from work, her skin bronzed from the desert sun. Regret it? She said finally, turning to meet his dark eyes. Nowell, that other life would have been someone else's story. This is mine. This village, these people, our child growing inside me, the work we're doing to build bridges between our peoples. This is who I was meant to be. She reached up to trace the strong line of his jaw. You didn't just buy me at that auction, my love. You set me free to become the woman I never knew I could be. 3 days later, when Nahwal returned from the successful rescue mission with 5 grateful women and their families, he found Cordelia teaching a mixed group of Apache and white children to read using both English letters and Apache pictographs. The sight stopped him in his tracks, not just because of her skill as a teacher, but because of what it represented. These children would grow up truly belonging to both worlds, equally comfortable in wickiups and wooden houses, equally fluent in Apache wisdom and book learning. They would be living proof that love could indeed triumph over fear. That understanding was possible between peoples who'd been taught to see each other as enemies. That night, as they lay together under their blankets with her head on his chest, Cordelia felt their baby stir restlessly in her womb. Our child will never know the hatred that divided our peoples, she murmured sleepily. Because of what you chose to build here, Nahwal replied softly. Because you saw past fear to possibility. We built it together, she corrected. A warrior chief and a stubborn white woman who refused to accept that love couldn't conquer anything. As sleep claimed them both, wrapped in each other's arms in their humble desert home, neither could have imagined how their love story would be remembered, how their village would grow into a thriving town that welcomed people of all races and backgrounds, how their children and grandchildren would carry their legacy of courage and acceptance into a new century. But perhaps that was fitting. After all, the greatest love stories aren't about the glory they achieve, but about the hope they inspire, the quiet proof that two hearts willing to fight for each other can indeed change the world. One choice at a time. And in the vast Arizona desert, where the stars burned bright and eternal above Red Canyon walls, their love burned just as bright, just as eternal, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed to believe such love was possible. The end. You're coming with me. Giant Apache bought her at auction just to cook, but she stole his heart.